I can't believe there's this many people. It's great to see this many people interested in your microbiome. We kind of consider that a nerdy subject in the United States. My name is Steve Woody. I'm the CEO and founder of Avadim Technologies. And going to take you through a little bit today about topical immunocompetency and the role it is playing in infection. And I'll apologize right up front. There's your English, and there's English in the United States, which we don't do near as well as you. And then there's English in the southern part, which I'm from North Carolina. So we're very southern. So if I say something that doesn't make sense, or please put up your hand and go, I didn't understand what that was, Steve. But we'll try to keep the science down. We just really want to introduce the concept, but we'll talk about a little bit of the science because I think it's really, really important to where we're going. So a little bit about Avadim. We are the 162nd, I guess, fastest growing company in the United States for privately held companies. And the success that we've had has really come out of changing this paradigm of reducing infections, not by just killing organisms, but by improving topical immunology, basically, of your skin. And there's two components to that. There's your stratum corneum, which is that outside layer of your skin, and it has these 10 defensive functions that I've got Jack Payne with me. He's our VP of Clinical Development. He's going to be sharing. We're going to be going back and forth a little bit. But it's really a combination of these two foundational elements, the functions and defensive functions of your stratum corneum and your microbiome. And how do those relate together? And I think the reason why we're here in terms of history, when we looked at how we wanted to address infections versus what we want to do today, is they were kind of overlooked. The stratum corneum was only really discovered 40 years ago. We thought that your skin was just dead flaking skin. We didn't know it had these defensive functions. The microbiome, of course, if you've kept up with that, you're familiar with the microbiome of your gut, but you may not be all that familiar with the microbiome topically because you have so many complex microbiomes. The microbiome of your skin is just so much more complex, and the studies and the science is just now allowing us to look at it. So we're taking those and putting those together, and that's really where we talk about the topical immunotherapies. So having said that, so this is why we call this emerging revolution. It's a really different way of looking at things. And what I'm going to take you through is what is the old paradigm, this thing of infection prevention by just killing organisms, which we're all familiar with. We'll talk about these protective functions of the healthy skin and the microbiome. Certainly the clinical aspects of skin acidification. And that's one of the key ways that we get your skin to work. Your skin has to be acidic, which acidic means a pH of about 5, which is where we roughly all are about. It's very, very important. And we'll talk about the fact that your skin acidity is not the same when you're born, through your adulthood, and then going up into when we get elderly, our pH starts to increase again. So we're ever changing, and we've never really taken that into account. And then I'll finish up with a little bit about topical immunocompetency as far as what we say is the new frontier. Not just what we're doing today, but what we kind of envision 3 years, 4 years, 5 years out. The old paradigm, it's this old guy kind of really talks to it a little bit. This idea that if we killed organisms, we are going to reduce infections. There is some truth to that. But the idea that you could kill off all the good bacteria in your skin and that was going to improve your situation is what we're arguing. And so let's talk about that a little bit, what we previously thought. There's really three components to this: the host or the patient, the environment they're in, and the pathogens themselves. So we really thought that we knew that pathogens were causing infections. If we could reduce those level of pathogens, we could absolutely reduce infections. And I think we've seen some of that. But there's this phase that goes on as we kill off all of your organisms. Remember, we killed off the good bacteria that's very defensive on your behalf. And so what grows back? What happens is the pathogens want to start growing back, because when we use a lot of the topical antiseptics we're using today, alcohols, chlorhexadines, and those types of things, and the products that we've been promoting right now have been used in the ICU for addressing patients, high-risk patients in ICUs. That's really where we focused, reducing urinary tract infections with indwelling catheters, that sort of thing. So taking into account all of these things, this is the way we looked at it, and we want to go really a completely different way. What are some of the consequences of the antiseptics we've been using? Do they demonstrate true proven effectiveness? Well, we're starting to see in the United States, the CDC, Center for Disease Control, has no longer made the recommendation that we should be using chlorhexadine as a pre-surgical wash before we go into surgeries, because there isn't a correlation between that and reducing surgical site infections. So a lot of the things that we thought we knew, as we're starting to see the studies, it's really not true. Do the benefits outweigh the adverse effects? Well, obviously, I'm pitching it from a side that if we could actually improve your immunocompetency, your ability for your body to fend for itself, we're saying no. Do they demonstrate systemic absorption concerns? This is a real concern in the United States. There's a new standard being put out by the FDA concerning the top 22 topical antiseptics, and where they have to meet new requirements. You know, when they did this originally, no one did any repeat dose studies around if you put alcohol on your hands 60 times a day. We know that if you're doing that, it's bad for breastfeeding mothers, pregnant women. There's a whole host of issues of systemic absorption and the issues it's causing. So we're really starting to look at that. Is resistance to pathogens beginning to emerge? Obviously it is. We see a lot of that around chlorhexadine, even alcohols in the United States. And that's one of the things that, to be a topical antiseptic in the United States, that you're going to have to meet that is to demonstrate there isn't a resistance. And I think that's what's so exciting about what we're proposing, is that when you look at MRSA, VRE, Pseudomonas, those types of things, they want to flourish at a neutral pH of 7. Your skin is naturally acidic at 5. So your good flora in your skin wants to grow at 5, and the pathogens don't want to grow there, and vice versa. So when we think about resistance, if we work on the topical immunology, we don't have a resistance issue. It's the way your body was designed to work in the first place. You shouldn't be getting these types of infections. So talking about chlorhexadine is just one of those examples where it's been really under a lot of pressure in our country. It's what we've commonly used for 50 years. It's the only thing that we really had. Obviously, it wasn't acceptable to use in the face or the perineum or in and around wounds. We've been using it in our ICUs, what we call off-label. It's actually not indicated. It's never been approved by the Food and Drug Administration as a topical antiseptic. It wasn't that way in 1994. The new ruling that just came out in 2017, it's not approved as a topical antiseptic. It is approved as an antiseptic for pre-surgical site of 5 inches by 5 inches, but it's never meant to be used over the entire body. We've had a lot of FDA warnings around anaphylaxis. And finally, the FDA has just recently, really they ruled this in 1994, but they indicated that, or reiterated, I should say, that chlorhexadine is not recognized as safe. You know, it doesn't have a GRAS or GRAS certification. And that's pretty typical, because when we look at killing organisms, we weren't looking for something to be non-toxic. We wanted something that was toxic, obviously. But it had such other negative effects. So what's the emerging data? These are quotes that have come from some of the papers that have been done most recently about how the skin immune system, when preserved and potentially enhanced, is a powerful protective element against infection. That our healthy skin ecosystem is critical to generating the onset of this immune response, and I can go on. I think one of the most interesting things here is, if you'll see down the corner, that the health skin ecosystem also contributes to immunological memory. So your T cells actually remembers when it had that last infection, and it actually can follow up on attacks from that same pathogen after it's remembered it's had that. And so I think you're starting to see the amazing complexities, and I should say really the amazing function that your skin and its immunology system has in keeping us from infection. So just to take you guys back and a little bit back into school, and this will kind of set up for Jack to share. But you know, this is the levels of your epidermis, and the area that we really focus on is this top part where you see the stratum corneum, and you'll see the stratum corneum disjunctum and the compactum, and you'll see that basically you go through your human, I call it your human spacesuit, every 28 days. You're going to go through 1,000 spacesuits in your lifetime. And those spacesuits change a bit. And one of the most important things about that, I think, is the stratum corneum as it goes from the compactum up. And you have this redundancy. You have a redundancy of 20 to 30 layers. And that redundancy is really, really critical. And as we get older, we start to lose some of that redundancy. Or we can have certain places in our life where we're in a cancer event or stress or different things where we change this. And so I just wanted you to kind of take you back and think about from the basal level there where we're creating cells and as they move up and how they become that final layer that finally gets shed off. And think about the topical antiseptics that we use today. And what they do is they destroy that top layer of the stratum disjunctum. That's why when you see your skin drying out and we're using lotions, you thought the skin was just drying out. Really what was happening there is you're starting to lose some of those 10 defensive functions associated with your stratum corneum, as well as you're disbalancing, you're creating a position of dysbiosis for your microbiome. In other words, it's out of balance. And so those are the things that are going on as we talk about this. So I just wanted you to have some background to how the layers work with your skin and the stratum corneum. And with that, Jack?
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to talk about the outermost layer of the epidermis, the stratum corneum. This is truly a remarkable tissue. I think I'm going to use the word brilliant. I hear that a lot over here, and I think it is a brilliant tissue. It provides several different protections for the human body. And I'll let you read them real quickly here. Obviously, this being an infection prevention conference, we're going to focus on the second one, and that is the maintenance of the naturally antimicrobial acidic mantle of the surface of the skin, the stratum corneum. This tissue is only about 35 microns thick, so imagine a very thin piece of paper as the outer layer of your skin, and to think that it performs all of these protective functions for the body is really quite remarkable. I'm going to advance this. Here we go. I'm going to talk about 3 different types of protections that the stratum corneum provides from an infection prevention standpoint: structural, environmental, and biochemical protections. And the structural protections really are primarily related, obviously, to its structure. The structure of the stratum corneum is frequently called a bricks and mortar structure. That's a term that was coined back in the early 1970s by a very famous research dermatologist who's actually on our medical and science board, Peter Elias. And it's an apt description of this tissue because essentially what you've got, the bricks, which are terminal keratinocytes, which have become enucleated and also are in the process of becoming cornified and drying out as they approach the skin surface and are being in the process of being ready to be sloughed off through desquamation. And you can see that those form a very hard cornified barrier, and they're surrounded by a lipid structure, which is a thick lipid structure comprised of 3 specific types of lipids, which are present in almost an exact 1-to-1 molar ratio: cholesterols, ceramides, and long-chain free fatty acids. So if you think about a pathogen trying to ingress through this physical structure, you can see that there are tremendous challenges, and when combined with the other protections I'll mention in the other 2 types of protections, I'll see that this provides in itself a very strong protection. Everything in here is also pH dependent. The little corneodesmosomes, which are the little protein rivets that hold the corneocytes together, are controlled by enzymes which are pH dependent. At the proper low pH, about 5, that's a logarithmic scale, so 100 times more acidic than neutral, the enzymes controlling those allow desquamation to proceed at exactly the right amount. As the pH rises, that binding power lessens, and that's when you begin to see skin sloughing off at too high of a rate and problems. Also, the productions of the lipids, which is done in little organelles down at the interface of the stratum corneum and the stratum granulosum. The enzymes that control the production of the lipid precursors and the lipids themselves are also pH dependent and proceed optimally in a low pH environment. The formation of what are called the lamellar bilayers, these lipids align in little bilayer formations, that's pH dependent. So that low pH condition is so important to the structural protection. Next, let's talk about environmental protection, and we're going to talk in depth about this a little bit later in the presentation. This relates primarily to the normal microbiome. In a normal low pH condition, the normal flora, the healthy microbiome exists very well. Healthy flora typically thrives in a low pH environment. Pathogens don't do well in a low pH environment. In a low pH environment, the healthy flora takes up a lot of the space that's available to land on the surface of the skin in the stratum corneum. They also compete successfully for the nutrients which are available on the stratum corneum, which makes it much more difficult for pathogens to maintain a foothold. And in addition, there are other elements of what this normal flora does. Many of these have been discovered within the last 3 or 4 years as the skin microbiome has come under more and more scrutiny. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the specific elements of what the normal microbiome does later in the presentation. But, whoop, here I am, sorry about that. That was my water glass, I didn't need that anyway. But we see some specific activity of some of the normal flora against other specific pathogens. Staph epidermidis is probably the most remarkable of these. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. But the presence of an adequate amount of Staph epidermidis has a negative impact on any Staph aureus which might be present on the surface of the skin. It inhibits colonization of Staph aureus in the nares and also inhibits the formation of biofilms by Staph aureus, all because of a separate type strain of Staphylococcus organism which acts against Staph aureus, which is really kind of remarkable. And the Propionibacterium also assists in production of some of the antimicrobial peptides, which I'm going to talk about as I move on to the biochemical protections. Within the stratum corneum, you've got a lot of different substances, particularly in a low pH environment, which are strongly antimicrobial. There are 40 different types of antimicrobial peptides in the stratum corneum. They vary in their ability to kill various types of pathogens. The most effective of all is LL37, also called human cathelicidin. It's the only cathelicidin present in the human stratum corneum. It's also the most effective. It's very effective against gram-positive, gram-negative bacteria, yeast, fungus, even viruses. And it has been studied by some of the ethical drug manufacturers to determine how they might be able to mimic some of its activity to be more effective antibiotics. So our own creation produces something that is very, very effective against a whole range of different organisms. And I think that I'm now going to turn this back over to Steve for a couple of other slides. I'll be back.
Yeah, there will be a test at the end of this, so you'll have to know all of that. So what we want you to do is just consider this idea of topical immunocompetency and the role that it could play in your facilities. Just for so I could have some understanding, could you raise your hand? How many people here are in acute care hospital settings? All right, and how many would be long-term care? So it's mostly acute care. Okay, that's helpful. So let's talk about how do we do this? Now that you know a little bit about the microbiome, you know about the stratum corneum, how would we begin to manage your immune system? Well, really there's 4 elements, and you'll see the first one is we want to manage the microbial load. So we do want to lower your organisms, but I don't want to lower it so far like we might do with a chlorhexadine or an alcohol, where we want, up until now it's been how fast do I kill, how much do I kill, and how many different types of pathogens do I kill. And I would argue here is that we want to lower the burden, but we don't want to take it that far. And then the second part of it is, could we do that in a low pH environment? Jack just shared with you that in a lower pH environment, pathogens don't want to flourish. But bigger than that, in that lower pH, if you'll notice at the bottom, the natural flora growth is fantastic. And so what's happening there is we're pushing out pathogens and their ability to survive. Not to mention, and we'll talk a little bit further in this presentation, about how your natural flora plays such a key role in your defense, your defensive nature. And then finally, the antimicrobial peptides, what he spoke about. So in that low pH environment, you are creating these incredible antibiotics that's basically what we've been killing off. When we took this approach to just killing organisms, we increased the pH by using some of these topical antiseptics we're using today, and we destroyed this whole antimicrobial peptide and FMAs that are coming up to the surface that are fighting on our behalf. Here's the most interesting fact about this, is these antimicrobial peptides, when they come up to the surface, are selective. Your organisms that are normally on your skin are used to seeing them, but for the pathogens that are out of control, they recognize that. So the fact that these antibiotics come up to the surface and are selective are huge. And it's so vital that we maintain the pH of our patients. So when we look at what are the key players in the skin immune system, well, we talked about number one already, the antimicrobial peptides that are coming up. Cytokines, which are signalers of inflammation. We can, in a lower pH environment, we can shut that off. Certainly, Jack referred to our structural cells and just the fact that it's bricks and mortar and the role that it plays. And I love his statement here, like the cavalry in the American Westerns, they charge in at the very end. And that's kind of the way we look at this. So why is the skin microbiome so critical? Well, we now know that these collection of organisms on our body, and up to 4 or 5 pounds of you can be organisms that aren't you. And that might gross you out a little bit, but y'all are all in healthcare, so you take on everything. But the fact that you have these organisms that we really never considered before, maybe you even thought that they were bad, as it turns out, your microbiota is having conversations with your body. And they're having conversations back and forth and signaling each other from a defensive standpoint. And again, some of our most recent research is suggesting what's going on with our memory T cells that I was talking about earlier and the role that those play when they've seen an invasion in the past. So microbiome symbiosis versus dysbiosis. The biggest thing that we have is that most of us are getting into unbalanced situation when we have things like atopic dermatitis and those things, which we don't think too much about. But as the patient moves into an ICU, those issues can get really critical because they're opening up pathways for infection, or the dysbiosis is really creating an opportunity where the infection is going to happen. Look at Staph epidermis. It's present in 90% of us. Staph aureus, it's in 30 to 50% of us. A lot of you think that that's a bad thing. A lot of us have Pseudomonas. That's pretty typical. The problem is when Pseudomonas or Staph aureus gets out of control. And a lot of the balance of your microbiome is what keeps it in control. So this is really, if you don't take away anything, this is the one thing I want you to take away, is what happens with a traditional antiseptic product. And you'll see that your natural flora starts to fall off because, yes, you killed off some organisms in the beginning. This is after we've applied. What happens is, in a higher pH environment, the natural flora is not going to survive. The pathogens, the thing that you were trying to get rid of, actually in this higher pH environment goes, this is great. I don't have to compete with the natural flora, and it actually starts to grow back. And it grows back much more. So you can see really what happened was I took this patient, I was trying to kill some organisms, I was trying to improve their situation, but really what I did is I brought on dysbiosis. And I'm sure you've seen that in your settings. What's happening with Theraworx in our particular approach, and I'm not saying we're the only ones that do this, but we are leading this, is what if we could reduce the burden of the skin and do it in a low pH environment and keep the stratum corneum functioning the way it should be and your microbiome in balance. And what happens is, as time goes on, your pathogens, they can't flourish, so they're going to continue to go down, your natural flora is going to go up, and we're going to bring you into a much more balanced defensive microbiome. And it's very important to understand that it's not just one treatment. It's treatment after treatment. if we're treating a patient in a long-term care setting, or I should say an ICU, I'd prefer to be able to give them, 2 baths a day with our technology. We've done that in some of our leading children's hospitals where they're fighting bone marrow transplant scenarios where their VRE infections can get really out of control. And we're treating those bone marrow transplant children twice a day. Well, you'd never consider doing that with a topical antiseptic. It's too toxic. So this is where it gets really interesting. I alluded to it earlier about what happens to your pH of your skin over your life. Well, infants, when we're born, it's about 6.5. So it takes us 4 to 6 weeks to get acidic. So we really need to critically look at how are we dealing with infants when they're first born. In the United States, unfortunately, the first thing you'll get is a bath, usually with a soap that's about a 12 or a 13 pH. It's actually the worst thing that we could be doing. We really want to accelerate that. And then as we get to be adults, you're down at a good low pH of 5. And by the way, not all of us have the same pH. Men and women are different. Pigmented skin is different. So your patients are a little bit all over the place in that regard. But remember, in general, we talk about it being 5. You get to be my age, I'm 56. My pH starts to go up. I don't create the antimicrobial peptides that I once did. And what happens is that those defensive nature of my skin starts to go away. My skin starts to slough off. It's one of the reasons why I start to wrinkle. And no comments on the wrinkling, but as I get older, and once we get to be, let's just say we're 80 years old and we're in ICU, that patient that's in that far part of this, that's in the red, is a way different patient than we were dealing with before. She or he is on a lot of antibiotics. Their immune system's torn down. Their skin is in tatters at this point. And a lot of the things we're doing, and we think about soap and water, and you go, soap and water is safer. All your soap and water is all at a pH of 12 and 13. Don't think that soap and water is necessarily your best friend here. We've got to reestablish that lower acidic pH, let the stratum corneum grow back and restore. And when we do that, we can really have a significant effect. So we imagine being able to address therapies across this whole continuum from when someone's born. We're even working with hospitals with prenatal children that we're trying to really improve skin health when they're in the 21, 22-week range. So I spoke to you a little bit about customizing these specific microbiomes based on your age and your gender. Even where your geography is from can make a big difference. In the United States, if you're in Arizona, it's very dry. Your microbiome may look way different than somebody in Miami where it's moist. It's not saying one's better than the other, but that you have to take those into account because the organisms on those patients are going to look completely different. So you can imagine that based on even a disease state for cancer, for example, that we might start to look at you a little bit different as we go down the road and we learn more. So what I'd like to do, this is great. It's not all theory. We have a lot of data around this, but I wanted Jack to present a case study of what we've been able to do with reducing urinary tract infections in the United States and just show that there is proof that this really does work.
Thanks, Steve. Before I talk about the case study, I just want to mention one thing, and that is we're not making this up, okay? We actually had USB drives that we were going to give away to everyone today. Someone at the customs office at Heathrow Airport has found those to be of high interest, along with all of our other booth materials, including our booth and all of our samples. So we're a little bit depleted here in our ability to discuss with you. But if you'd like to see that USB, if you'll come by our booth, we'll take your name and address down or get your card and we'll get those to you. It includes 3 specific papers. These are review papers. One of them is now about 10 years old, written by Peter Elias, who really many consider to be kind of the father of stratum corneum research. It's called The Skin Barrier as an Innate Immune Element. This has truly been our Bible as a company over the last few years. And Dr. Elias is on our medical and science board. I talked to him this week. He's very, very active in our product development efforts as we hope to develop our concepts far beyond our initial clinical product. The next one challenged my college biochemistry and zoology, but I was able to wander through it. But it's got an unbelievable amount of recent data about studies relating to all of these specific interactions within the skin immune system and how they're impacted by various events. and conditions. It's called Skin Immune Landscape Inside and Outside the Organism. And the last one is absolutely incredible. This is a very recent review which came out in late 2017. It's called Dialogue Between Skin Microbiota and Immunity. And this was published in Science magazine. Some of you may have read that one. But we're going to get the USBs to you if you'd like to read more about this. These are far deeper dives, but I think it'll give you perhaps an even better appreciation of the potential of this technology, which our company and of course others hope to exploit to provide benefit for patient care in the years to come. This is a really truly emerging infection prevention concept. But as Steve says, and just a quick proviso, we presented in Leeds at the Knowlex conference last summer, and we got generally positive comments from the people who attended, but we did get a few people that said that it was too much of a sales presentation. So those of you that don't want to see a sales presentation, you don't have to pay attention to the next 2 or 3 slides, because what we're going to talk about is the product, our clinical product in the United States, with which we've had great success, and which many hospitals have looked to as an alternative to chlorhexadine and other topical infection prevention products. And in this study, we looked at 10 of the using hospitals for our topical patented low pH, microbiome supportive, non-toxic, biocompatible formula used for patients who were Foley catheterized. And we compared periods averaging 23 months in these 10 hospitals prior to implementation of a protocol and therapy involving our topical products, Theraworx Protect, and periods averaging 15 months post-implementation. And the average reduction in CAUTI rates, average CAUTI rates per month that was experienced by those 10 hospitals was 53%. Now, I can tell you that the range was fairly broad. We actually had 4 of the 10 hospitals that were able to achieve 0 CAUTI for periods as long as 21 months post-implementation. We had others who didn't see that much of an improvement at all. But I can tell you anecdotally, based on our intimate knowledge of these individual situations, I can assure you that hospitals that were very vigilant about following our recommended protocols had far better success. And those hospitals that were really highly compliant were the ones that had the best success. We recommend for Foley catheterized patients what we call a reestablishment of the zone of inhibition from the top of the knee to the umbilicus, because who knows where that, regardless of what fixation type device you're using, that Foley sometimes tends to flop around. And reestablishment of that low pH condition in that entire area, Q8 hours, we feel that if that's followed diligently, you can really, really do a tremendous job in reducing your CAUTI rates. But just to get to the details of the study, our product was introduced as the hygiene agent for insertion and cleaning of the perineum in all Foley catheterized patients in 10 hospitals, and only in the ICU units, including neuro-ICU units and other very challenging populations. Specific patent-pending protocols for use were also introduced. We did extensive in-service training in all these facilities, of course, all shifts. And we studied the CAUTI rates, as I said, averaging 23 months prior to introduction of our therapy to periods averaging 14 months after introduction. And then the average reduction, as I said, in monthly CAUTI rates in the facilities in the study was 53%, and 4 of our hospitals achieved 0 CAUTI throughout the period of post-implementation. So a pretty strong result. I think from what we've heard as here in the UK, CAUTI continues to be perhaps the most challenging infection to produce strong reductions, and we are seeing tremendous success with our product in this application and other infection prevention applications within the U.S. Patient bathing is also something we've done well in, because our product is mucous membrane safe, skin friendly. It can be used in the perineum and the face, so our bathing system has 8 cloths instead of the typical 6 cloths that you see in for instance, a CHG bathing system. So there are a lot of different range of applications that we can talk about. We have a few copies of this study in our booth, only a few. But again, if you'll come by and give us a card, or I can write down your address, we'll be happy to send this to you so you can take a look at it in more detail. But it's been a real advantage for us to have that study as we moved ahead. So to wrap this up and allow some time for questions, I'm going to let Steve come back up and finish up.
So again, just to kind of look at the future a little bit, I think skin antisepsis has a role, but we don't want to do this blanket approach where we just kill everything. And I think there'll be some unique spaces for it, like maybe pre-surgical site prep, those types of things. But I still think there might be an interesting role. How could we reduce organisms but increase the immunocompetency of that space where we're going to have surgery? Certainly increasing our knowledge and role of topical agents and normal skin immune processes. The microbiome mapping, as we start to learn, that science is really only about 5 years old. And so if someone wanted to ask you what's a good microbiome, we couldn't tell you. It's even difficult right now for us to map a microbiome. Forget the fact that you have multiple microbiomes on your body. If we're talking about your foot or under your arm or in your abdomen or in your perineum, your forehead, all of these are way different microbiomes. Certainly we'll have individualized and customized approaches to specific pathogens and disease states. We see that. But at the end, if we do this, and we're seeing success now, I think that's the one thing I want you to take away, is there is success on this front. And we're just doing it in just the very beginning. And there is so much to be learned about the microbiome, even the stratum corneum. We talk about the 10 defensive functions of the stratum corneum. Dr. Elias is working on 6 more. So to tell you that we know everything about how this works, that's wrong. That science is still emerging. But I think what's so exciting is we've been able to actually take it from a theory and actually put it into practice, and we're doing it in facilities all over the country. And at the end, it's all about better health care, happier patients, and lower costs. Avadim, our name, it's a weird name to say, but it means servant. And our company is all about serving one another, serving our patients. And so it's really at the core of what we want to do. Is there's no reason to do this if we're not making our patients healthier. So what are some of the impacts or some of the things that you could take away from this? Whatever you're doing, challenge your thought, particularly looking at topicals that you might use that would affect high pH. Challenge the antiseptics and stay up to date on the things that are coming out, whether it be positive or negative. Stay aware of the emerging science. I just told you we're really in the very beginning of this. So there is a lot of emerging science. Just because we've been doing it for 50 years, it doesn't mean what we're supposed to be doing going forward. And certainly challenging traditional thinking. We're seeing that in our institutions every day. If we're really going to change healthcare, we have to start thinking outside of the box. And we have picked up some things over the 50 years or 30 years that we think that's just the way it's always been done. Let's challenge those things. And finally, listen, thank you for listening to such a geeky subject. I apologize. You guys have been great. And as I always say, thanks from the Yanks. We appreciate it. Thank you so much.